I'm Joe Pardavila. You are listening to the Forbes Books Podcast. And you hear all the time about successful business people who write blogs for the specific purpose of elevating their brand and their authority. But how about regular people who turn their blog into a business? When I came down to Charleston to work with Forbes Books, I was lost. I had spent my entire life in New York City and had no idea where to eat or what to do in South Carolina's Low Country. Luckily, I found Holy City Senger. The blog and its accompanying social media accounts are a must-follow for everything there is to know about what's going on in Charleston. And for nearly a decade, Christian Senger's blog has been a must-read for locals, tourists, and especially transplants. Christian, how are you?
I'm doing well, Joe. Thanks so much for having me today.
You're very welcome. And so one of the reasons I wanted to reach out to you is you've built an incredible following in the Low Country of South Carolina, which is the Charleston area, with your blog, Holy City Senger, and then exploded it with social media. So if you don't mind, take us back to how you ended up in Charleston and what was the inspiration to start the blog?
Sure. So I was pretty fresh out of college. I grew up in Connecticut, went to UConn, trying to find my place as far as jobs and things like that, my post-college world. And, I didn't really have a goal or plan in place. And, a few of my friends were able to get jobs in Charleston. And, I went to go visit them and I was like, wow, this place is pretty amazing. And kept coming down a few times over the next year or so and just decided, that I wanted to give it a shot. And so decided to move here. And that was back in the summer of 2007. So I've been here quite a while. Really glad I made the choice. Certainly miss my family who all live back up in Connecticut, but they're able to visit. I'm able to visit them. And but outside of them, I'm really, really happy that I moved down here and just fell in love with the area, which I know a lot of people listening who have moved to Charleston, they get it. When you come here, it's just a special place. So, after I'd been here for a while, I was overwhelmed with all the different things that you could do and just trying to get my bearings and learning about the city and the state. And just like anybody else who comes here, whether tourist or new to the area, having moved here, there's those big events that you can't miss. They're covered by the news. They're in all the papers. They're advertised, when these things are coming up. But after a while, I started to realize there was a lot of smaller events or businesses or really cool people that you don't hear about traditionally in the news, just because there's only so much space that they can cover. And I thought, it'd be kind of fun to start a website, like a blog that talks about the stuff I did in Charleston. Maybe it'll be interesting to people who are visiting or people who are looking for new things. I can say, hey, I went to this place. Don't know if you've heard about it. Here's what my experience was. And so that's how it started, was kind of like that. But then after a while, it kind of transformed, and it's less of here's what I'm doing and what I think, and more of what's coming up in town, what's happening in town, regardless if I have gone and done this thing or not, as well as talking about other aspects of the city, not necessarily events. Could be a new business that's opening, a restaurant is closed, a TV show or a movie is filming here. Just like anything happening day-to-day Charleston is kind of what I want Holy City Senger to be at this point, is just like a news source. But, less hard news that you could easily get anywhere else, and more of, what the culture is like here, what people are doing who live here, and some of the smaller things that they may not have discovered yet. And yeah, that's kind of how it came to be and where it's at now.
And what prepared you for that? Were you like a guy who liked blogging? Were you a tech person? What prepared you to do that? Or was it just sort of like, it almost sounds like it was an accident, but did you have a skill set that you had acquired before you even launched the blog?
Yeah, so it was an accident as far as, what it's become. But, I had ideas and I thought it could potentially be a resource for people. But yeah, my background for college, my undergrad, I was a double major in journalism and communications. So I had a general background as far as media, and I'd always, prior to college, loved radio. I thought like DJs were the coolest people, before I knew anything about the profession. I just thought, oh, it must be the coolest job ever. And people in the news, anchors and Sports Center and ESPN and all that stuff. I just was in love with all things media and was kind of a news dork. Like I was always interested in not just what was going on in the news, but how it was reported, and what that looked like behind the scenes. So, went to college for that and worked for the college newspaper, radio station, and TV station, and just really, really loved working for all three and getting to see the background and being part of the news as far as not being in it, but presenting it to people and informing people. So I really loved doing it and had a general idea of certain standards and things like that. And so that certainly helped out where I could tell, like, okay, this might be newsy to people, this might be interesting, and making sure that I'm covering things the right way, even though I'm not a real journalist, and I'm definitely giving opinions and things. I still try to cover things in the correct way, not putting out anything that hasn't been fact checked or anything that's inaccurate.
Excellent. So I'm curious, along the journey when you just started as a blog where you were like, hey, this is what I did this weekend, this was fun, to what it's become now, what was sort of that Oprah aha moment or flip switch moment, fill in your own metaphor moment, that you were like, whoa, this is an actual thing. This can become something more than me just spouting about what my weekend was like.
I think there was a couple things. There started, because when I started the site, which was in 2011, Twitter was still very much like in its infancy. And so I was starting to get like a decent amount of followers. And of course, back then it was easier than it is now because it wasn't so saturated with accounts. But I was like, oh, people are interested in following an account that's talking about what's going on in town. So that kind of led me to think, oh, I don't have to just talk about things I've done before. I can say, hey, this thing is coming up. Maybe you're interested in it, even though I haven't myself done it yet. As long as I don't say, like, this will be amazing, as long as I'm just like, here's what's happening. So that was that was the first realization, like, oh, I can expand this a little bit. But the bigger one, I think, was when I got my first like press release sent to me, where they're like, "Hey, really like what you're doing with the site. Here is some information about my client and something they have coming up." And I was like, "Oh, wait a minute. People are going to reach out and they want me to share news and stuff that's going on." And that's when that kind of the light bulb like fully went on of, "Oh, okay, I can kind of shape this and mold this into something a little different than what I've been doing." And it could really be beneficial for myself and for people who follow it. And so, yeah, those are probably the two big moments for me.
And when did you realize at that point about the impact you would have on entrepreneurs, restaurants, hotels? When did you realize the impact that you would have? Because a lot of these folks that you were probably getting press releases had minuscule social media presence or maybe were just opening up. When did you realize that you had the power to really make or break a new restaurant, a bar, or something like that with the Holy City Center blog?
I don't know if there was one particular instance. I think just over time, I started to realize that me sharing things can be impactful. I don't, as long as I'm not doing like an overly, as long as I'm giving like a negative review, I don't think I can necessarily make or break some businesses, although I appreciate you saying that, thinking I have that amount of power. But as far as being helpful and putting at least a few more eyes on things, over probably within that first year or so, I started to get, whether it was PR people or actual people involved in the things I was talking about, messaging me or meeting me in person at an event and just thanking me like, hey, thank you so much. We appreciate that coverage. And after like a year or so, it started to be like, not just thank you for the coverage, but, oh, we've had multiple people come in and when we asked them how they heard about our business, they said it was from Holy City Center. So like when I started getting that feedback, because it's one thing, like I'm putting stuff on the internet and it's kind of like, even though I know people can see it, you're not getting that feedback constantly. So you don't always know what's hitting and what's not. So when you actually hear that feedback, when you meet someone, it's really impactful to me. But yeah, I started to get comments like that, and it started to pick up over time as each year passed. There'd be more and more people saying like, thanks so much. We asked people how they heard about us or why they attended this event, and they said either you recommended it or you just posted about it. So yeah, probably about a year or so in is when I first started getting feedback like that. And it's just increases each year as it's grown.
That's awesome. And we both have similar backgrounds because we're both transplants, or what some Southerners like to do is call us Yankees. I
Yes.
came from New York. You came from Connecticut. I came down for podcasting. You came down for a new life. And one of the things that was incredibly helpful that when I stumbled upon Holy Citizen Center online was like, I didn't know where anything was. I didn't know whether it was good. So it was a lifeline. And do you feel like you have such an impact, especially since so much has been made about the mass migration that has happened over the last couple of years, but in Charleston over the last 10 years, how helpful your services are to all these new people that are flooding the low country?
Yeah, for sure. Especially when I first started transitioning it to more of like a news-ish platform versus like a traditional blog, I tried to keep in mind, like, okay, what would I want to hear about, or what would I need if I moved here? So I've tried to create, whether it's like a resource or a page that details, like for instance, upcoming restaurants that are planned for Charleston, just like a list that I keep updating, just things like that would have been helpful for me, So I try to keep that in mind as a transplant, but also, yeah, in addition to businesses, probably the most common feedback I get are from people who have moved here. It's not that locals don't comment and say like, "Oh, thanks for talking about this," or "Oh, I didn't even know about that and I've lived here forever." I get those too, but the most, besides businesses, the most feedback I get comes from transplants or periodically tourists as well. People who love Charleston but don't know all the ins and outs, kind of like you said yourself, having being somewhat new to the area. I do get a lot of feedback like, "Oh, when I moved here, I visited your site every day," or "I still look at your site even though I've been here for a few years because I always know I can find what's happening in town on your calendar." And so, yeah, I do get a lot of feedback from transplants as well. And again, it's just, I'm one myself, and so I kind of knew what I needed, and what I would have liked when I first moved here. So I try to keep that in mind.
And in terms of transplants, it's funny that you say that because I feel like nobody's from Charleston. I have this
Yeah.
joke. You run into two people when you live in Charleston. One is someone who came here for college and stayed, or someone who came here for a man or woman and stayed. It's it's one of those two things.
Yes.
It's very rare to find someone who's lived here for over 10 years, because that's what sort of when Charleston really kicked in. Like you kind of came in at the beginning of the wave, right?
Yeah.
Of people coming down south. And talk to me about the change of Charleston now and 10 years ago, because you will run into the folks who are like, "Oh man, I'm so sick of the traffic and all this other stuff." And of course, us being from Northeast Christian, we laugh at people who what they consider traffic down here. But how has Charleston changed in the 10 years you've been here?
A lot. I mean, a lot. And you're right. I moved down here like right when things were about to explode down here. I think it was 3 or 4 years after I moved here when Charleston started winning all those like best of the world, best of the United States, best everything. It was like that crush of awards and accolades and media coverage. It was, yeah, like a few years after I moved here, which also, helped my site as well. Because all of a sudden there was a bunch of people moving here and still are. As far as the city itself, the most obvious is development. I mean, it's crazy how much, whether it's downtown, like there were certain parts that you didn't go to because there were no businesses. Like, I think of like upper King Street. Yeah, Rec Room has been there for a long time, but outside of that, there really wasn't anything that you would go down that way for. And now there's multiple businesses, not just all the way up King Street, but now it's spreading on the sides of King Street as well. There's so many apartments and student housing even that they've built. You can also look at places like Johns Island, which has kind of become a hot place for people to move to, where it's not the city, like the peninsula, but is still Charleston, is still pretty close to a lot of the things you want to do, and all the businesses and restaurants that are being built out there now too, and developments. I mean, that is easily the clearest thing, is just how much has been built, and how much the city has expanded kind of like its footprint of where you go, whether it's shopping or drinking and eating or living even. Like it just keeps growing and growing. It's crazy.
And it's funny that you mentioned that King Street example, because that's the one I get a lot from folks down here. And for people who are not from the Charleston area, King Street, if you've ever been to New York, it's basically your Broadway, right? It's a lot of shopping, a lot of restaurants. It's where tourists love to just walk up and down for an entire day. And I will say, Christian, I'm sure you spend a lot of time in New York as well. The great thing about Charleston is, with New York, it probably takes you a week to walk through the whole city. You can walk most of the peninsula in a day, day and a half, which is pretty awesome. And the fact that you're 10 to 15 minutes from a beach, I think that's what offers such a great opportunity for folks when they come down here. Because if you've ever lived in a metropolitan area, you usually got to it's a little bit of a drive to get to a beach or get to a place where you could just hang out and spend the day. But here you kind of have all of that within a few minutes of each other. That I feel is such a big attraction for folks.
Oh, absolutely. That's what I love most about Charleston. I mean, I grew up in a small town in Connecticut, but so any city is going to seem different to me. But obviously in Connecticut, I've been to Boston, I've been to New York City, and I've been to other cities outside the Northeast as well. And I love the kind of small city feel where you still get the city vibe when you're on the peninsula, especially, but it's not that overwhelming crush of people that you see in New York. And yeah, you are in driving distance to anything, and not just driving distance, but like, as you mentioned, like a pretty quick distance. You're really not that far from really anything you'd want to do. And that's another thing that makes it such a special city.
Now, well, one of the things when I talk to entrepreneurs, they're always asking me, especially if they're just really pushing a social media agenda, like where they want to try to gain followers or become thought leaders in their space. They always say, "How do I do it?" And I'm sure you get this probably on a daily basis because the numbers for Holy City Center are very impressive. Almost 50,000 on Twitter. You've got over 11,000 on Instagram, and then 22,000 on Facebook. All pretty impressive numbers for basically a local blog. Most people would kill for numbers like that. I know there's no magic bullet. Trust me, I know. But how do you explain the growth in those three verticals? Whether it's just a broad discussion or just in general, how do you think you were able to do that?
Yeah, I'm glad you said there's no like one solution for everybody, because every business is different, and some lend themselves better to social media than others. So for instance, what I'm doing, basically like news aggregation on, especially on Twitter, and sharing what's happening in town. Those things are perfect for social media, whereas depending on what kind of business you're opening, you may never see numbers close to what I have. And that doesn't mean that your business isn't good, obviously. It's just that it doesn't necessarily translate well to a social media environment. So you have to keep that in mind. Like, don't get too bogged down in the numbers, because number one, some things just don't work on certain social media platforms. Like restaurants do way better on Instagram than they're going to do on Twitter, because of course Instagram photos, et cetera. So you have to know which platform is going to be best for you, but also small numbers. And I say that, it's all relative. If they're active and engaged, that's more valuable than having a bunch of follows of people who don't really care what you're posting and what you're doing. If you can have like the majority of people that are following you be, whichever platform, be super engaged with you, and every time you post like a special or you're selling a service, that a lot of them buy it, that's just as good as having a bigger platform, with a much smaller interaction percentage. So that's part of it. But the other thing too, and again, this might not translate to every business, but if people can tell that you enjoy what you're doing, that you believe in what you're doing, they're more likely to support it than, if they feel like they're constantly being sold to, or it seems fake, or, like it's clear, like, you see some businesses try to do like a funny tweet or do a silly thing on TikTok, and it's clear that they're actively trying to go viral, versus just like, hey, we're doing something that we think is fun or interesting. People get turned off by that, so yes, a lot of it is luck. A lot of it is, for instance, like I said, I started at the infancy of Twitter. If I started right now, it would be a completely different ball game. But the only thing that I think doesn't change is that people really do want to support businesses and entrepreneurs, nonprofits, whatever it may be, especially if they're local. And if you can, again, just be as genuine as possible with however you operate your business, whether it's on socials or in person or whatever, and you treat people right, and take constructive criticism and things like that, you're going to be fine. And again, you may not see whatever number you have in your mind as far as follows or likes or whatever, but if you just keep on doing it and you're consistent, and again, genuine, and showing that you believe in what you're doing, people will come eventually, and the ones that do will probably stick with you for a long time. And they'll be more, like I said before, they're more likely to interact with you and support you consistently than if you just like got one thing that went viral that got you a bunch of follows of people who don't really care about your business. They just thought, oh, maybe they're going to post more funny stuff.
Right.
It's more valuable if you are consistent and genuine with it.
Yeah, it's funny. You point out something that I wrote about in my book that I'm putting out this summer, and that's the argument between community and audience. Because I feel, and something like Ken, you just said, it's more important to build a community than an audience
Absolutely.
because a community is the one that's going to stick with you. I make a point in my book to say, do you want to be Planet Fitness or Peloton? Now, regardless of what Peloton's going through, their stock prices, whatever, no one's going to tell you that they go to Planet Fitness. But the person who does Peloton, they're going to tweet about it. They're going to post it on TikTok. They're going to tell everyone and their mother. That's and again, it's a kind of a goofy kind of anecdote that I use there, but I
No,
think
it's right though.
it's an example of what you're talking about. If you're a restaurant, you don't need to have 1 million followers. You need to have maybe 5,000, and 500 of those are regular customers who's going to come to your restaurant on a frequent basis. So we're pretty much on the same page in that, and it's about building that community. And you started with that community, obviously rather small, and then it became this huge thing. Do you wonder, like, how the hell did this happen? Is it because it seemed like it happened, like you said, very organically, that all of a sudden you're posting all these things and it just builds and builds and builds, and then it becomes this thing where now PR people are hitting you up for hits. How cool is that?
No, it's incredibly cool, and it's wild to me, especially because that's not like what I set out to do. I thought, hey, it'd be cool if this or that happens, but yeah, sometimes since I've been doing this for almost 11 years now, I don't pay attention to the followers and stuff as much as I used to. I used to be looking like, okay, I'm just 100 away from 5,000, and I would celebrate that myself and all that. And that's become less of the goal and the focus, but every once in a while I have to step back and number one, celebrate some of the cool things that have happened, but also I have to look at that, and it's wild. I it's weird to talk about. But I don't want it to seem like I'm like bragging or something. But to be at almost 50,000 followers on Twitter is so bizarre to me. Like to think about how many people that actually is. Now, of course, a lot of those aren't active. Some of those may not even interact with me, even if they are active. But still, that sheer number of people for, like you said, just like a blog about Charleston, not even like a national. I'm not sharing national news. That's pretty cool, and it's mind blowing to think everything that's happened with the site. It's been incredible, and I'm thankful to everybody who supports it that has been able to let me have some really cool experiences by supporting me. So yeah, I'm grateful, and it is pretty amazing.
And on a personal note, divulge as much as you can, but is this profitable? Is this a side hustle? Is this your main hustle? Talk to me about that.
At this point, it's kind of like a co main hustle. So I have a full time job outside of the site, and I'm not at that point where I could leave that job, but I'm also it's no longer a pipe dream. Like it could possibly happen. It's a matter of I'm not going to bore everybody with it, but there's some things I need to do to make sure that I can actually make Holy City Center just my full-time job. So, but between the amount of hours I put in and the money I'm able to bring in, yeah, it's much closer than it used to be. Like in the beginning, it was very much just not even a side hustle. It was just a fun thing I did, and then it stayed that way for a while, and then it kind of became like, oh, a little side thing I can make some money. But now it's doing much better, and yeah, it's not out of the realm of possibility that it could be a full-time job.
That's awesome. And in terms of the actual holycitycenter.com, is it you? Are you a one-man band? Do you have people helping you? Take us behind the scenes. How's it work?
Sure. So yeah, for the most part, really high percentage is me. It's all me. But I do have some people who contribute posts, for me, guest writers, or I have a couple people who will submit things, usually like things that I'm not able to go to, or maybe I'm not interested in. I'll have people who are like, hey, I know you're not a huge fan of, say, country music, and nothing against country music. It just isn't something that I'm going out to and doing. and they'll be like, "There's a bunch of concerts coming up. I'd love to go and write about them." But yeah, absolutely. Just because I'm not into it doesn't mean a ton of people in Charleston aren't. So yeah, so I have some people who do provide some guest posts and things like that, and then there are some people I pay for, website, like security, and I have a producer for my podcast that handles all that. So there are some people, that do help, but for the most part, it's all me.
So did you ever think about yourself as an entrepreneur? I know I feature entrepreneurs on this podcast because that's essentially what you are. You're a business.
Yeah, yeah.
I mean,
I
is that weird?
Extremely, yeah,
Yeah.
extremely. Because no, that was not the goal. That was not what I planned to do. But after a few years of doing it, I realized that this could be a business, whether it's like you said before, just a side hustle or a full-time gig. And so eventually, I finally was like, I guess I should start treating this like a business. It just seemed weird to me because when I think of entrepreneurs, I wasn't thinking about people who created a blog. Basically, I was thinking of like brick and mortar businesses and things, and
Right.
so I never really thought that way. But yeah, eventually I got stuff trademarked and got an LLC and all that stuff, and I was like, oh yeah, this is like legitimately a business. And yeah, I hadn't thought about it, but someone within the last couple of years had mentioned like me being an entrepreneur, and it took me a minute. I'm like, yeah, I guess I am. Like, it's really strange because I just didn't set out to do it. It was a happy accident for sure.
And lastly, Holy City Sinner has won a ton of awards, named the best local blog for almost 10 years. Can you explain why it's so successful, why it's so good? Because now I'm sure you have competition. Like when you started it, you yourself were doing it because there was nothing like that out there. Explain the success 10 years later.
It's tough. I don't know, to be honest with you, for sure, without speaking to the people that follow me. But based on feedback I've gotten and just what I feel, I think part of it is consistency. Posting every day, or close to it, providing reliable information to people, and not, although social media, sometimes I give opinions on things, and my own opinion about politics locally, especially sometimes. For the most part, there's not a whole lot of super controversial things going on, which helps. But even when I do give opinions, most people are like, all right, cool, whatever. He gave it in a respectful manner and isn't like talking down to people. Like, he is just giving his opinion. So, I think people see, even when I'm doing stuff like that, I'm being genuine and I'm trying to be true to myself and be respectful to people. And, I think all of that together has, made it successful. But I think the biggest thing is just, consistency and reliability. That's when people are looking for events and things to do in town, and, again, not like traditional hard news, but, more some news stuff. They want it to be accurate. They want to be told as soon as possible, and they want it to be consistent. And I think that's what people appreciate the most about it, and why Holy City Center continues to do well.
That's awesome. All right, I lied. I have one more thing because
That's fine.
if you live in the Charleston area, basically everything has Holy City in their title. Holy City Plumbing, Holy City HVAC, Holy City Taxidermy. Why Holy City Sinner? Tell me about the name.
Sure, sure. So, as you just mentioned, a lot of businesses have Holy City, and I'm sure their thought process was the same, which is, I love that. I think that's such a cool nickname for a city to have. A lot of cities have really cool names, but Charleston's was lesser known, especially when I first moved here. When you think about, oh, everybody knows the Big Apple,
Right.
everybody knows that, but not everyone knows Holy City. And I just thought that was such a cool name. And I thought that'd be fun to play with. I thought there was a lot of imagery and themes and fun stuff I could do with it. So from there, I had to decide, okay, well, it's not just going to be called Holy City. I have to add something to it. I thought Sinner was the best because, one, I think it's just kind of silly and fun, and tongue in cheek, but also plays on the opposites of the city. It's called the Holy City, and there's steeples everywhere and all sorts of religious buildings and properties around town. And you think of the Deep South and genteel and all that kind of stuff, but we have a dark history, some very dark,
Yeah.
but mom's thinking more of the fun dark stuff, like crazy drinking stories and establishments and things of that nature. We have the ghost stories and the ghost tours, and so as much as you can see people in church every Sunday, you might see those same people getting a little rowdy on King Street the night before. So it's just like a look at both sides of the city. Like, yeah, we have that like pristine, look at us. We're very, like I said before, genteel and holy, but we can also have a little fun and get a little silly and weird as well. So I just thought that worked well, and thankfully, people seem to like the name and get that's what I was going for with it.
Not bad for a Yankee who became an accidental entrepreneur. Nice job.
There you go.
Christian.
Thank you.
His name is Christian Senger. He's the founder and editor of HolyCityCenter.com. Christian, thank you very much for the time, and good luck, bro.
Joe, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
You are welcome, and that is it for this episode of the Forbes Books Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, make sure you take a quick second to subscribe so you automatically get new shows when they drop. Also, if you have a minute, I would love if you left us a review so more amazing entrepreneurs like yourself can discover the show. And please don't forget the golden rule and treat others as you want to be treated. Thanks for listening. Until next time, adios.